There are places where the night feels different. Not darker, just closer. Places where the silence seems to have weight, where every sound carries farther than it should, and where being alone doesn't feel like being alone at all. At the top of Mount Calder, nearly 3,000 meters above sea level, there was an old astronomical observatory that had been operating for more than 40 years. It was called Calder Ridge Observatory. The observatory had once been considered one of the best small research facilities in the region. Scientists came there to monitor distant stars, track asteroids, and photograph objects that couldn't be seen with ordinary telescopes. But by the time Daniel arrived, the place was barely functioning. The observatory had only one permanent employee left. His name was Thomas Reed. Daniel had been hired as a temporary technician after the previous technician quit without explanation. The job was supposed to last 6 weeks. His responsibilities were simple: check the electrical systems, maintain the telescope, monitor the weather equipment, and most importantly, keep the observatory running during the overnight observation sessions. Daniel had been warned about the isolation. He had been warned about the cold. He had even been warned that the mountain's weather could change without warning. Nobody had warned him about the telescope. He arrived just before sunset. The road leading up the mountain was narrow and almost completely empty. The final 20 kilometers were covered in snow, and there were no houses, gas stations, or telephone towers anywhere along the route. When Daniel finally saw the observatory, he almost missed it. It was a low concrete building surrounded by rock and snow. Above it stood the enormous white dome. The structure looked less like a research facility and more like something abandoned decades ago. Thomas was waiting outside. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, wearing a thick winter jacket and holding a flashlight. He didn't smile when Daniel got out of the truck. Instead, he looked past him, toward the road, then toward the sky. "You're late." Daniel checked his watch. "I'm 5 minutes early." Thomas stared at him for a moment. Then he turned around. "Come inside." The first thing Daniel noticed about the observatory was the smell. Old metal, dust, and something damp underneath it. The interior was warmer than outside, but not by much. Thomas showed him the control room, the sleeping quarters, the kitchen, and finally the telescope chamber. The telescope itself was enormous. It occupied almost the entire center of the room, a massive optical instrument mounted on a motorized platform beneath the rotating dome. Daniel had worked with telescopes before, but nothing this old. He walked around it slowly. When was this installed? 1983. Still operational? Thomas hesitated. Technically. Daniel laughed. Thomas didn't. That was the first strange thing. The second came when Thomas showed him the observation schedule. There were several periods marked in red. Daniel assumed they were maintenance windows. "What's this?" Thomas looked at the paper. "Don't worry about those." "Why?" "Because you're not supposed to operate the telescope during those times." Daniel looked at the schedule again. The red periods occurred every night, always between 2:13 and 2:47 a.m. "Why?" Thomas folded the paper. "Because that's when we stop observing." Daniel waited for an explanation. None came. That night, Daniel unpacked his things and settled into the small sleeping room. The observatory was incredibly quiet. No traffic, no insects, no distant machinery, only wind. At around midnight, Daniel woke up. He didn't know why. For several seconds, he simply lay there staring at the ceiling. Then he heard it, a low mechanical sound. Something was moving. Daniel sat up. The sound came again, a slow metallic grinding. He checked his phone. 2:13 a.m. He remembered the schedule. Daniel got out of bed. He walked down the hallway toward the telescope chamber. The door was open. Inside, the lights were off. The telescope was moving. Slowly, very slowly. The huge instrument was rotating toward the dome opening. Daniel froze. He remembered Thomas telling him not to operate it, but he hadn't touched anything. The telescope continued moving, then stopped. Daniel looked upward. The dome was open. Through the opening, he could see the night sky. Thousands of stars filled the darkness. Nothing unusual. Then the telescope moved again. Only this time, it wasn't pointing upward. It was pointing toward the horizon. Daniel stepped closer to the control console. A monitor was still running. On the screen was a live image from the telescope. At first, Daniel thought he was looking at a mountain, a dark silhouette against the night. But then he noticed something. The image was moving, not the camera, the object itself. It appeared to be extremely far away, yet it was getting larger. Daniel stared at the screen. He couldn't understand what he was seeing. Then the image suddenly changed. The screen went black. A single line of text appeared. Signal acquired. Daniel stepped backward. Behind him, something clicked. He turned. Thomas was standing in the doorway. He looked terrified. Not angry. Not surprised. Terrified. "Turn it off." Daniel pointed toward the screen. "What is that?" "Turn it off." "I didn't activate anything." "I know." Thomas walked quickly toward the control panel. He reached for the main switch. Before he could touch it, the monitor flickered. A new image appeared. This time, Daniel recognized what he was looking at. It was the observatory, the exact building they were standing inside. The image showed the mountain from above. Daniel stared at it. Then his stomach dropped. The observatory was visible. The dome was open, and two tiny figures were standing beside the telescope. Daniel slowly turned toward Thomas. "That's us." Thomas didn't answer, because he was staring at the screen too. Then Daniel noticed something else. There was a third figure, standing behind them, inside the telescope chamber. Daniel turned around. Nothing. The room was empty. He looked back at the monitor. The third figure was still there, and now it was closer. Thomas grabbed Daniel by the arm. "Don't look at it." Daniel looked at him. "What?" "Whatever you do." Thomas's voice became barely audible. "Don't look through the telescope." Then the observatory lights went out. Every light. At exactly 2:17 a.m. And somewhere inside the darkness, something knocked 3 times against the metal dome. Knock. 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 The 3 knocks echoed through the observatory. For a few seconds, neither Daniel nor Thomas moved. The darkness was absolute. Daniel could hear the wind outside, hammering against the dome. Then came another sound, a slow scrape. Something was moving across the metal surface above them. Thomas whispered, "Stay away from the windows." Daniel couldn't see him. "What's outside?" Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him toward the control room. They moved through the darkness. Daniel nearly tripped over a cable. When they reached the control room, Thomas closed the door and locked it. He opened a drawer beneath the main console and pulled out an old emergency lantern. The weak yellow light revealed his face. He looked much older than he had earlier. "What is happening?" Daniel asked. Thomas sat down. For several seconds, he simply stared at the floor. Then he said, "It started in 1997. Daniel waited. "That year, we detected a signal." "From space?" Thomas nodded. "At first, we thought it was interference, a repeating radio pulse, every 17 minutes. "What kind of signal?" "We couldn't decode it." Thomas looked toward the ceiling, but one of the researchers noticed something. "What?" The signal wasn't random. Thomas pulled an old notebook from the drawer. Its cover was cracked and stained. He opened it to a page filled with handwritten numbers. The pulses were changing. Daniel looked at the calculations. "Changing how?" "They were responding to us." Daniel frowned. Thomas pointed toward one of the columns. "We changed the frequency." The next column contained another sequence. The signal changed too. Daniel stared at the numbers. Someone was answering. Thomas shook his head. "No." He closed the notebook. Something was learning. A loud metallic bang came from above. Daniel jumped. Thomas immediately raised one finger. Silence. They listened. Nothing. Then another bang. This time, from the opposite side of the dome. Daniel whispered, "Is that what you saw before?" Thomas looked at him. "I've never seen it." "Then what is it?" Thomas hesitated. "That's the problem. The emergency lantern flickered. For a moment, the room became completely dark. When the light returned, Daniel noticed something on the computer monitor. A red indicator was blinking. Telescope active. Daniel walked toward it. Thomas grabbed his shoulder. Don't. But the telescope is running. I know. We need to shut it down. No. Thomas's grip tightened. If we shut it down now, it will know we're here. Daniel stared at him. That doesn't make any sense. Thomas didn't respond. Then the computer made a sound. A single notification appeared. New image received. Daniel leaned closer. The screen displayed a black and white photograph. At first it looked like an ordinary mountain landscape. Then Daniel noticed a structure in the distance. A small building. He recognized it immediately. The observatory. But something was wrong. The photograph appeared to have been taken from inside the mountain. Daniel could see the observatory through a narrow opening in the rock. Where did this come from? Thomas didn't answer. Another image appeared. This one was closer. The observatory filled most of the screen. Then another, and another. Each photograph showed the building from a different angle, as if something was moving around it. Watching, Daniel stepped backward. How is it taking these pictures? Thomas whispered, It isn't. Daniel looked at him. Thomas pointed toward the telescope. The telescope is receiving them. The monitor suddenly displayed another photograph. Daniel's blood ran cold. The image showed the control room. It showed Daniel and Thomas standing exactly where they were now. The photograph had been taken from behind them. Daniel turned around. Nothing. He looked back at the screen. The image had changed. The figure was closer. It was standing directly behind Daniel. He spun around again. Nothing. Then he heard breathing. Not his. Not Thomas's. Something slow and deep. Right beside his ear. Daniel froze. Thomas suddenly shouted, Don't turn around. The breathing stopped. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He could feel something standing behind him. Then the computer beeped. A new message appeared. Distance. 14 meters. Thomas stared at the screen. The number changed. 13 meters. Then 12 meters. Daniel whispered, How can it be measuring distance? Thomas didn't answer. The number continued falling. 10 meters. 9 meters. 8 meters. Then the lights came back on. Daniel immediately turned. There was nothing behind him. The room was empty. Thomas was staring at the monitor. The distance had stopped changing. 0 meters. Daniel looked toward the telescope chamber. The door was still closed. Then came a sound from inside. A soft metallic click. The telescope dome began rotating. Slowly. Thomas's face went pale. We have to leave. Now. Now. They ran toward the main entrance. Thomas grabbed the emergency radio. He switched it on. Static filled the room. Mayday. Calder Ridge Observatory calling. Do you copy? Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. Then a voice came through. Very faint. Calder Ridge. Thomas froze. The voice repeated. Calder Ridge. Daniel grabbed the radio. Yes. This is Calder Ridge Observatory. We have an emergency. Static. Then the voice replied. How many people are inside? Daniel looked at Thomas. 2. The radio remained silent. Then, that's not possible. Daniel's heart stopped. Thomas slowly lowered the radio. What does that mean? Daniel asked. The voice returned. This time clearer. There should only be one. The radio went dead. Then the telescope chamber door opened. Neither of them had touched it. A narrow beam of moonlight entered the control room. Thomas whispered, Don't look. Daniel looked anyway. The telescope was pointing directly at them. Its enormous lens reflected a faint blue light. And in the center of the lens, Daniel saw a human face. It looked exactly like his own, but the face was smiling. Daniel stumbled backward. Thomas grabbed him. Run! They sprinted toward the emergency exit. Behind them, the telescope began moving, not rotating, following. The motor screamed as the massive instrument turned toward them. Then the dome above them began closing. And just before the doors slammed shut, Daniel heard a voice coming from inside the telescope. His own voice, whispering, "You're not supposed to leave." The emergency door burst open. Freezing wind hit them. They ran outside into the snow. Thomas kept running downhill. Daniel followed. Neither of them looked back, but after several seconds, Daniel heard something strange. Footsteps. Behind them. One set, then two, then three. Daniel looked at Thomas. Thomas was already looking back. His face changed instantly. "Keep running." "What?" "Don't count them." Daniel heard the footsteps getting closer. He wanted to look, but Thomas grabbed his shoulder. "Whatever you hear." He looked terrified. "Don't turn around." Then, from somewhere behind them in the darkness, Daniel heard his own voice. "Thomas." Thomas stopped. Daniel stared at him. The voice came again. "Thomas." It sounded exactly like Daniel. Thomas closed his eyes and whispered, "That's how it gets you." Then something screamed from the mountain, and every light inside the observatory turned on at once. Thomas didn't wait for Daniel to ask another question. "Keep moving." They continued down the mountain. The snow was getting deeper, and the wind had become so strong that Daniel could barely keep his eyes open. Behind them, the observatory remained fully illuminated. Every window glowed against the darkness. But something was wrong. The lights weren't steady. They were flickering in sequence. One window, then another, almost like someone was walking through the building. Daniel finally looked back. Thomas shouted, "I told you not to." Daniel immediately turned around, but he'd already seen it. A figure was standing inside the observatory's main window. It was too far away to identify. Then another figure appeared, and another. 3 silhouettes, standing perfectly still, watching them leave. Daniel whispered, "Who are they?" Thomas didn't answer. They kept walking. After nearly 20 minutes, they reached the old service station halfway down the mountain. There was a small radio tower there. Thomas pushed open the door. Inside was a generator and an emergency communication system. He immediately started the generator. The machine coughed several times before finally starting. Thomas grabbed the radio. "Mountain emergency station to base. Do you copy?" "Static." He tried again. Nothing. Then the radio crackled. A voice came through. "Calder Ridge Observatory." Thomas froze. The voice was calm. Almost too calm. "This is the Mountain Rescue Service. We received your emergency transmission." Thomas looked at Daniel. "How far away are you?" The voice replied, "Approximately 6 kilometers." Thomas looked relieved. "Can you send someone?" There was a pause. "Yes." Daniel finally relaxed. Then the voice continued, "But we need to confirm something first." Thomas's expression changed. "What? How many people are currently at the observatory?" Thomas slowly raised the radio. "None." Silence. Then the voice said, "That's strange." Daniel looked at Thomas. The voice continued, "We can see someone standing outside the building." Thomas's face went completely white. Daniel stepped closer to the radio. "Who?" The voice didn't answer immediately. Then, "One person." Daniel looked toward the window. The observatory was barely visible through the snow, but one light was still shining. The telescope dome was open, and beneath it stood a person, too far away to identify. Thomas whispered, "That's impossible." The radio crackled. Then the rescue operator said something that made Daniel's stomach turn. "The person is waving at us." Thomas immediately turned off the radio. He grabbed his coat. "We're leaving." "Where?" "Down." They left the station and continued toward the valley. They didn't stop. Not once. By sunrise, they reached the main road. A rescue vehicle was waiting. 2 men stepped out. One of them approached Thomas. "Mr. Reed." Thomas nodded. "You called for help?" "Yes." The man looked toward Daniel. "Who is he?" "Daniel. New technician." The rescuer stared at him, then looked at Thomas. "New technician?" Thomas nodded. "Yes." The rescuer's expression became confused. "Mr. Reed." He lowered his voice. "There hasn't been a technician assigned to Calder Ridge for almost 6 years." Daniel stared at him. "What?" The rescuer looked at Thomas. "You've been alone up there." Thomas said nothing. The other rescuer walked toward the vehicle. "There's something you need to see." They followed him. Inside the rescue vehicle was a laptop connected to the observatory's security system. The rescuer opened the footage. This is from last night. The screen showed the control room. Thomas was sitting at the console. Alone. Daniel wasn't there. Thomas watched the footage without blinking. Then the video continued. At 2:13 a.m., Thomas stood up. He looked toward the telescope. A few seconds later, he appeared to speak to someone. But there was nobody beside him. Daniel stared at the screen. That's not possible. The rescuer paused the footage. There. He pointed. Behind Thomas was a dark figure. The figure was barely visible, but it was standing exactly where Daniel remembered standing. The rescuer zoomed in. The image became distorted. Daniel's face appeared on the screen. Thomas suddenly shut the laptop. That's enough. Nobody spoke. The rescue vehicle drove down the mountain. Daniel sat beside the window. For the first time since arriving, he felt safe. The mountain disappeared behind them. Hours later, they reached the nearest town. Daniel was taken to a small clinic for observation. Thomas disappeared. The rescue team told Daniel that they needed to return to the mountain to inspect the observatory. He never saw Thomas again. 3 days later, Daniel received a phone call. It was from the observatory's research director. She asked him a strange question. "Daniel, did Thomas tell you about the signal?" Daniel said yes. There was a long silence. Then she asked, "Did he tell you what the signal was transmitting?" "No." The woman sighed. "Good." Daniel frowned. "Why?" "Because we decoded it." "What did it say?" Another silence. Then she answered. "It wasn't a message." Daniel waited. "It was a coordinate." "A coordinate to what?" The woman whispered. "To us." The call ended. Daniel couldn't sleep that night. At approximately 2:13 a.m., his phone turned on by itself. The screen displayed a notification. No sender. No application. Just a single message. Signal acquired. Daniel dropped the phone. A second message appeared. Distance, 0 meters. Then a photograph appeared. Daniel slowly picked up the phone. It was a photograph of his bedroom, taken from the corner of the ceiling. He looked around. Nothing. Another photograph appeared. This one showed him standing beside the bed. The timestamp was 2:13 a.m. Daniel stared at it. His phone camera was facing him. Then another image appeared. It showed the mountain, the observatory, the telescope dome, and someone standing beneath it. Daniel zoomed in. The person was wearing his jacket. His face was impossible to see. Then the final image appeared. It showed the observatory control room. Thomas was sitting at the telescope console, alive, looking directly at the camera. Behind him stood Daniel. Daniel froze. He looked at the timestamp, 2:47 a.m. Then he noticed something written on the bottom of the photograph. A sentence, written in handwriting he recognized. His own. "I finally understand why Thomas wouldn't let me look through the telescope." Daniel's phone screen went black. From somewhere outside his bedroom came 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Daniel didn't move. Then a voice whispered from the other side of the door. It sounded exactly like him. "Daniel." A pause. "Open the door." He didn't. The voice came again, this time much closer. "Daniel." Then the door handle began to turn, and somewhere thousands of meters above the town, inside the abandoned mountain observatory, the telescope slowly moved toward the sky. Its lens focused on a distant point of light, a point that was getting closer, closer, and closer, until the entire screen went white. The last thing recorded in the observatory's system was a single line. "Observation complete. Subject located.